I hear that gratitude helps to reshape our thinking, reshape our brain, reshape our encounter with the world. And so in some ways, I want to think about this introduction as a way of paying gratitude, right, and being grateful. One, for this space, for this opportunity. Often, as a writer, young writer, you don't often get to curate things. You don't often get to make sort of decisions, and they are made for you. And so I want to thank Karen and Neville for saying, hey, how do we pull this off? How do we make sure that when we bring poetry into the room, it's not, as I say, a curtain, right, on the house of the conference, but it's part of the house. It is a brick, right? It is a foundation, right? And so I want to begin with us thinking about foundation. And one of the ways I think about the foundation of poetry participating in social justice comes from a poet named Adrienne Rich. And Adrienne Rich has this really beautiful poem called Dreamwood that you might know it, you might not. But in the middle of it, she's recollecting a dream, and then all of a sudden there's like this epiphantic moment where she says, poetry isn't revolution, but a way of knowing why it must come. Right? Poetry isn't revolution, but a way of knowing why it must come. Right? So a poem as a sort of epistemological way of seeing and knowing and being in the world. And when I think about these two poets, there's a way in which these two poets have shaped my thinking about poetry and its sort of coordination with social justice. Today, Dwayne and I were talking on the way back from the airport, and one of the things he said was, one of the things I'm trying to do in poetry is to get people to understand that the carceral state is all around them, even if it's like not in their lives in an explicit way. Right, and so I can't help but think of a poem then when I read a poem of his called For You, Anthophilus, Lover of Flowers. It starts, for you, Anthophilus, lover of flowers, green roses, chrysanthemums, lilies, retrophilia, phyllochily, philomath, sarcophilus, all this love of the past, of beauty, of knowledge, of flesh, this catalog encounter, philanthropist, negrophile, neophile. A Negro man walks down the street, taps Newport out against a brick wall, and stares at you. Love that. Lygophilia, lithophilus. Be amongst stones, amongst darkness. We are glass house, philopornis, philotechnical. Why not worship the demimonde? And in my class, we discussed, what is this demimonde? Right? What is he calling us to worship, right? What is he calling us to think about and care for? And when I think of prison abolition, and when we're talking about justice in these forms, we have to, Dwayne, I think, is in his work, not only explicitly addressing this, but he's implicitly through the idea of calling us to love, calling us to think about care, right? Or in Natalie's work, one of the things that I'm always sort of beset by in the best of ways and bewitched by is the way in which she moves between thinking about the erotics and the body as the erotic and the zone of loving and how that intersects particularly with the political, right, and as it intersects with the colony. So she has this poem. I'm going to read part of it just because I think it's important to put these poems next to each other. Postcolonial love poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snake bite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started, before those millennia ago and onward, those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever-blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love, and worse, always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flesh of your pale skin settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pull of my thirst. I learned drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon published by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel, turning green and mottled red. She goes on to say, the seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current. opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs, wake up and ache for your life. That is not the end of the poem, but I want to stop there because there's a way in which the poem is teaching us something. It is telling us to wake up, to ache for our lives, to turn right towards that ache, towards that struggle, towards the possibility of moving beyond it. It is because of these poems in this work that I thought of them when I was thinking about putting this panel together. I was thinking, what is the conversation we need to have in terms of poetry, in terms of thinking about the intersections of poetry and social justice? To get to the, and because I don't want to be before you long, because I can go on. I was raised in the Pentecostal tradition, which means we can be up here a long time. I'm going to get to the more formal sort of biography. What are those called? The biographies. So named a 2018 Guggenheim Fellow and a 2018 NEA Fellow, Dwayne Bett's poetry has been long praised. His writing has generated national attention and earned him a Soros Justice Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Ruth Lilly Fellowship, an NAACP Image Award, and a New America Fellowship. Betts has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post, as well as being interviewed on NPR's Fresh Air, the Travis Smiley Show, Travis Smiley Show, which I think is hilarious. I was like, I remember when that happened, man. I was watching that late. I had to stay up late night to watch that one. And several other national shows. He holds a BA from the University of Maryland, an MFA from the Warren Wilson College, where he was a Holden Fellow, and a JD from Yale Law School, where he was awarded the Israel H. Perez Prize for Best Student Note or Comment appearing in a Yale Law Journal. Also, if you're Dwayne Betts' friend on Facebook, you should tune in. He has some of the most amazing dialogues with these characters that I don't know if they're real, if they're part of his life, but you should definitely tune in. I would definitely give him an Emmy for these. He has a PhD in law candidate at Yale, and as a Lyman Fellow, he spent a year representing clients in the New Haven Public Defender's Office. His book of poems include Shaid reads his own poem, Bastards of the Reagan Era, and Now Felon, which we actually got here early. It's not supposed to be out till October 15th, so cop it if you can. His nonfiction book is entitled...
Do not bootleg it.
A Question of Freedom. Natalie Diaz, who will go first, was born in Fort Mojave Indian Village in Needles, California. She is Mojave and an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian community. She earned a BA from Old Dominion University, where she received a full athletic scholarship. Diaz played professional basketball in Europe and Asia before returning to Old Dominion to earn an MFA. She is the author of poetry collection When My Brother Was an Aztec, which the New York Times reviewer Eric McHenry described as an ambitious, beautiful book. It is more than that, right? It is a book that is sort of set poetry and set, I think, our current aesthetic moment on its head. Her newest work, Postcolonial Love Poem, is forthcoming from Grey Wolf Press in March 2020. Make sure y'all cop that when that comes out. Her honors and awards include the Nimrod Hardman Pablo Neruda Prize for Poetry, the Louis Untermeyer Scholarship of Poetry from Breadloaf, and the Narrative Poetry Prize, and a Lannan Literary Fellowship, as well as a MacArthur Fellowship. She's also received fellowships from Princeton University. Natalie is also one of my best friends and is an amazing thinker and doing some really amazing work around conversation and thinking. So would you please put your hands together, as they say, and welcome Natalie Diaz.
Iwan Jahotan, Ivak Edum, Ahokolo Imanch, Phoenix Imanch. Gracias por venir. It's my luck to be here. Thank you to Karen and Neville and your work, the Rapoport Center, Sissy for a lot of the work that's been done. Also, it's really lucky that Ruth, whose work has been very important to me, and also to be here with in the same room as Simone Brown, whose work has also been really important to me, and I think a lot of other indigenous scholars as we try to find some of the languages that we've needed to move through the world. Roger, again, I don't know that I could stay in this poetry world, whatever it is and whatever it's becoming, if I didn't have brothers, friends, like Roger to think alongside. That for me, poetry is the least of what I do. What happens on the page is the least of where I come from and where I hope I'm going. As well, it's always a luck to be anywhere around Dwayne, including in his books. I have a brother who spent most of his life in prison, and Dwayne's work has been incredibly important to him, so I'm really grateful. So I planned on coming here and reading, I'm keeping time, don't worry. Anytime like a native sighs and starts to talk, get worried. Are there any Indigenous or Native American people in the room? A couple. There used to be a lot more of us here. That's something to always think about, I think. We forget that about Texas. I planned on reading a very long piece of work that I've been working on called Punishment. And interestingly enough, I began it here when I was a teaching fellow here at UT. I see a couple of my Desiree's over there. It's lucky, Sarah. A lot of you are back. Yeah, good to see you all. And about 4 days before my sister was scheduled to go to her first hearing, because my family doesn't talk to each other, of course, and it was something that I think everyone was just pushing it off. She called me and said she needed help, and within less than a week, she had her first hearing. They gave her a public defender, and they were wanting her to settle for 12 years. She has 4 children. And so I was lucky enough that I was able to go into my bank account and buy a lawyer. A shitty lawyer, nonetheless. I'm from a very small town. We had a really hard time in that short amount of time finding a lawyer. That fellowship that I'd kept in the bank was from the Ford Foundation Fellowship. That's not lost on me. Ford is also funding some of this conference. Fast forward a few years, I sat on a panel that gave money to 10 incredible writers, phenomenal people, to continue their work writing about the carceral system. The money didn't originate with Ford, but it was administered by Ford. And I sat at that panel and helped decide whose work might be fueled by that money. Fast forward down the road a bit, I was part of a grant begun by another incredible person who's done a lot to, kind of open our eyes to not just the carceral system, but what happens after it, what needs to shift beyond it. I was given an amount of money to work with my sister, who was incarcerated at that time, to talk about the impact of the carceral system on my family. So we began conversations. We set up a fund to kind of keep her focused on some good things that might happen when she was out. And last year, I was reading an article, and it was talking about, it was implicating many foundations in the art system, in the art community. And one of the things I found out was that Ford had a pension plan with HIG. HIG merged to form Securus, which ran some of the television, basically the television sets. It's one way I can put it. We were never allowed to see my sister in person when she was incarcerated. We only ever saw her through a television screen. We had to pay for those phone calls. We had to pay for those visits. One of my dilemmas is, I thought, how can I give this money back? And then I realized in some ways I had. Ford, HIG no longer, they did sell Securus, but they also run several other privatized companies now in prisons. They've been very responsible for some of the mergers that have happened to, for food and healthcare, for example. My sister did have to see that healthcare system because the first few months she was in prison, they wouldn't give her her thyroid medication, so she was very ill. Also, we put money on our books so she could buy food from the commissary. And so, all that to say, I'm at a point in my career as an artist, as a poet, in saying, I have a question, is what is art in the face of capitalism, in the face of these privatized prison and detention centers? I'm not going to read that Project Punishment because I feel like I have a lot more emotional work to do and intellectual work to do with that. So again, that's just a question I wanted to share. I feel like it's a part of the conditions that I'm writing under right now, and I'm always very concerned with the conditions. I am going to read from this new book that's out, and one of the things this new book is concerned with is the idea of goodness. I was born on a reservation. I'm also Latinx. I'm queer. There are many, many ways of American goodness that I will never be able to achieve. In some ways, the reason why I have a kind of tint of goodness on me is because my brother and my sister are considered not good. And so the works I'm going to read right now with you are those that for me are questioning what is goodness. One of the ways that I have tried to think about my own futurity and the futurity of my beloveds is that I have to think beyond the settler colonial state. I think that's something that maybe some of you in this room might have a hard time doing. But I must think beyond it because I am from a lineage that existed before it, before that settler colonial state existed. In Mojave, when we think of, I'm thinking of the quote that Roger read, and a way of knowing why it must come, the end of that quote. And I'm thinking of Tina Kamp's, the way she thought of futurity and thinking of blackness, of being a black woman, to imagine what had to have happened. And I think there's a way, even as we're talking about abolition, we're thinking of the future, and I don't know that it's actually a future we're imagining ourselves in because it's happening through the settler colonial state. And it's a question I have. In Mojave, when we're talking about the future, there's a word we have called isamk. And it's an actual physical word, meaning I can't say it without having lifted up my body and be actually looking out toward a future. Because the only future we had was one we could imagine ourselves existing in and being in interaction with the land with. And so for me, part of what I'm going to be reading, they're love poems. I've tried to treat everybody in the body of this new book as the body of a beloved. If you know the song Maps by the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, and then we played it today earlier with the students, and then you'll know this from Beyonce sampled this as well. Beyonce sampled it from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, and then I sampled it from them. They don't love you like I love you. My mother said this to me long before Beyonce lifted the lyrics from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. And what my mother meant by don't stray was that she knew all about it, the way it feels to need someone to love you, someone not your kind, someone white, someone, some many who live because so many of mine have not, and further live on top of those of ours who don't. I'll say, I'll say, what is the United States, if not a clot of clouds, if not spilled milk or blood, if not the place we once were in the millions? America is maps. Maps are ghosts, white and layered with people and places I see through. My mother, like your mother, has always known best, knew that I'd been begging for them to lay my face against their white laps, to be held in something more than the loud light of their projectors as they flicker themselves sepia or blue all over my body. All this time, I thought my mother said, wait, as in, give them a little more time to know your worth, when really she said, wait, meaning heft, preparing me for the yoke of myself, the beast of my country's burdens, which is less worse than my country's plow. Yes, when my mother said, they don't love you like I love you, she meant, Natalie, that doesn't mean you aren't good. American arithmetic. Native Americans make up less than 1% of the population of America, 0.8% of 100%. Oh, mine efficient country. I do not remember the days before America. I do not remember the days when we were all here. Police kill Native Americans more than any other race. Race is a funny word. Race implies someone will win, implies I have as good a chance of winning as who wins the race, which isn't a race. Native Americans make up 1.9% of all police killings, higher per capita than any race. Sometimes race means run. I'm not good at math. Can you blame me? I've had an American education. We are Americans and we are less than 1% of Americans. We do a better job of dying by police than we do existing. When we are dying, who should we call? The police or our senator? Please, someone call my mother. At the National Museum of the American Indians, 68% of the collection is from the United States. I am doing my best to not become a museum of myself. I am doing my best to breathe in and out. I am begging, let me be lonely but not invisible. But in an American room of 100 people, I am Native American. Less than one, less than whole, I am less than myself, only a fraction of a body. Let's say I am only a hand. And when I slip it beneath the shirt of my lover, I disappear completely. I have an obsession with the Minotaur. This poem began, I was thinking actually about my brother. And I was thinking about the ways that our country, that our America, that our nation has prophesied who we become, what we become. I was thinking also about, and this I think bounces back for me right now with my dilemma with poetry, is I was thinking about how much the state actually needs me to push back against it in order to maintain its growth. I think about that being that I teach in a university. I think about that, how much of my resistance, how much of my frustration, how much of my what I think is anger or power does the state actually need to not only become itself, but to keep imagining itself? And is it possibly always 2 steps ahead of me? I, Minotaur. I am an invention, dark alarm. Briareus's hands striking the bells of my blood. Whose toll am I? I think too much. Each morning the Minotauramaki. Through the night I swing the sickle of my wonders, a harvest work of touch and worry. Spin dawn and its day burning my dead. Who fell in the night, what the night reaped. I am every answer, a mathematics of anxiety, how any mall can solve the mesquite tree for the pyre. In my chest, I am two-hearted always. Love and what love becomes arrive when they want to, and hungry. The locust disappeared the fields, then themselves. I bent, wept alone on the threshing floor, not over what went stick to the feasts. I wept for the locusts. I know what it's like to be appetite of your own appetite, citizen of what savages you, to dare bloom pleasure from your wounds and to bleed out from that bouquet. A head like mine was shaped on thirst. I dream what is wet or might quench, aquifers, rivers, cenotes, canals, the dusk mirage of lake above your knee I sip and lick, my tongue blush as the fluoresced ear of a jackrabbit. I obey what I don't understand, then I become it, which needs no understanding. The astonishment of my body's limits, how it is easily divided by a black field and the black field multiplied in stars, the throng of a lover constellating. Like any desert, I learn myself by what's desired of me, and I am demoned by those desires. For this I move like a wound, always, and fruiting, sweetened by the thorn. The tumbleweed turns and turns until it bursts free all its spores into the wind, until it is only what it might become. There is no such thing as time or June, only what you're born into, only waiting for the rain, for the flood, for what erupts my bad lands and my tired eyes in beauty, Mojave aster, desert globe mallow, where once was terrible nothing. There is no God here in these flesh hours, though your jaw is a temple and your hips strike like an axe, the labrys I injure myself against. But you, called to hear by me, come softly into the bull noon of my body, and not unknowingly. You've heard me churn and lather, yet knock and enter. Together we are the color of magnets and also their doing. Manganese, lodestone, ores, the light will not touch, so we touch the light. Give it to one another until we are riddled and leaking with it. What else can we prostrate or set before the large feet of our creators, if not the diminishment of the body, this book of scars? Sand grinds like gears between my teeth, sparkling small machinery of want. What question can I ask of the thing I am? All I have done and failed to do, the furrows I tear with my grief mouth, a map of myself carved by my own horns. I have a name, yet no one who will say it not roughly. I am your native, and this is my American labyrinth. Here I am, at your thighs, lilac-lit pools of ablution. Take my body and make of it a nation, a confession. Through you, even I can be clean. And I'll end on this. I'll finish Postcolonial Love Poem, which is a title poem. And of course, postcolonial is meant tongue-in-cheek. Some people are like, yeah, this is postcolonial, yeah. Yeah. Also, again, gracias for being here and being generous. Postcolonial love poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snakebite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started before those millennia ago and onward, those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever-blooming wounds. I was built by wage, So I wage love and worse. Always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learn drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wild flowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds down my shoulders, on my back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose-horned rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Arise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again.
Facts ain't never killed nobody, but it's known more years in cells than cities, than school, than lovers, than his favorite cousin lived, more years than freedom. We met before M ran up his time over 5-inch black and white, before K broke somebody's jaw with the lock in the sock, back when everyone thought they'd go home, before T went home and was murdered, before J went home and came back. He gives me the math for men I did my bid with. Yesterday I sat at a table with Star, remember him? I was looking at his balding head and he was looking at the grays that cover my crown. I looked at a juvie at a nearby table, both crown and beard stubble completely gray. We first discovered jail cells decades ago as teenagers. And today, a mirror reminded me of my disappeared self. Androgenic alopecia, a word for our vanishing hair. Latin describing how time will cause everything to recede. No word exists for the years that we've lost to prison. And I thought, Fats, describing a moment he shared with men he's known for decades, was thinking about all that lost. But he writes, looking at the landscape of gray that had become them, he realized it was far from over. Because all these rounds later, prison ain't still undefeated. And one of these days we might find us some free. That's called Essay on Reentry. So thank y'all for coming. Is this a law school? This is a law school, right? No, I'm fucked up. I'm confused for a few reasons. First is my first day of law school, I was told And I gotta stop quoting this dude because he's a friend of mine, and I know that somebody's recording this shit and it's gonna end up on YouTube or something. He's gonna be like, yeah, I was watching YouTube and you keep telling people that story and they think I'm a bad person. But my first day of law school, he said, yeah, you know, law school is the place where poets go to die. And so what I find impressive about this space and this opportunity and is that we think about social justice and we think about change, and usually things operate in these silos. And lawyers, people who are supposed to be faithful and committed to the word, often don't think about poetry. And so it's nice to find different parts of myself existing in one room. And so I thank all of the organizers. I think Roger, the truth is, like, Roger was like, you want to come out, read with Natalie? And I was already sold. It's only a few times in my life that I read behind somebody and thought, damn, I don't know if I want to read now. I might just, might tell some jokes, you know. Like, but I say one thing and then I'm going to start reading. One thing I will say is, you know, I mean, I think about what abolition means to me, and the truth is, like, Fats calls me. I was giving a talk a few days ago to some public defenders about what does it mean to include narratives in their stories of justice. And I told them, y'all motherfuckers think y'all heroes, and I get it. But I did 8.5 years, and I never met a convict, a felon, an inmate. And don't talk to me about formerly incarcerated. That's the shit that you made up to describe me, or some folks that came home made up to describe themselves. But when I go back to prisons, it's inmate, it's convict, it's felon. And we're not concerned with the language that people use to talk about us. We're concerned with the bars that still hold us captive. And I said, y'all talk about yourselves as y'all heroes. And I came to law school to be a public defender, but I never met somebody who really loved their public defender. Like, but I'm saying it ain't that some of them aren't dynamic and great, but it's a way in which we could be self-congratulatory about our roles in the engine of injustice. And I think that, but while I was there, Fats calls me, and I was like, oh, this is my band, let me answer this. And they were looking at me like, this dude is trifling. He's just gonna answer the phone. And then when I answered it, they heard the ringtone. I mean, they heard you now have a call from the Virginia Department of Corrections. And I answered it because I wanted them to know that when I think about this, or the way in which our lives are sort of invested in this work, it's not our lives are invested in this work when we come into the classroom, or our lives are invested in this work when we come into the courtroom. It's because you asking me not to answer the phone when he calls, when this might be the only time he could call me for the next 3 or 4 days. And so I'm gonna answer it. And then I'm gonna be like, look, we critiquing that work, just listen in, say what you want. And I'm gonna let you hear how joyful he is to know that, like, on a Sunday, you thinking about how to get his freedom, because they also don't know that part of the story. Anyway, I'm gonna read some poems. These poems are, it's like disclaimer, because it's at least 2 people in this room that know me. Jessica's in the back, Roger knows me. It's a disclaimer because, like, people think about poetry, and poetry is a sophisticated world in which the I is often, like, centered, because it's an immediacy that comes from writing from the first person. But the thing is that the poem is many, many things, and with these poems, what I try to do is embrace what it means to be multitudes. And so some of the poems, people, like the next poem I read is a poem about domestic violence. It'll be poems about alcoholism. It's poems about sexual assault. It's poems in which the speaker does things that I might not do, but it sounds like I'm doing it because it's an I. And one of the reasons I had to do that is because I'm writing about a world that I know and a world that I recognize. And if I'm really talking about letting people free, I need to figure out how to have uncomfortable conversations about people I love. People who got multiple homicides, you know, people who, night. In the night asleep, her eyes, woman, my woman, I name her as if she is mine. As if these hours that pass for the night belong to us. My nights belong to the memories I can't shake. My night and this woman, my woman, she tells me how it wasn't supposed to be like this. This insight, another Hail Mary, another haymaker. We live somewhere between almost there and not enough. Almost there. Her dreams and all that she lost for me is a kind of accounting. My woman, not this night, not these nights. The mind is less mine, more hurt, more hover than anything else. Shadow cloud, Or as she said it, you stalked me until I submitted. Love shapes itself into my hands wrapped around her throat. Have you loved like that? I'll call your P.O. is the thing she says. On this night with the men I robbed still lingering. A threat to the freedom I imagined she gave when we became cliche. Naked, tangled. This is always about me. How violence called to me like my woman moans when she thought all this was the promise of more than a funeral. When I grabbed her like that the first time, her legs held me tight. My woman thinking the cells in my past could make her control this. All the ways I starve. She threatens to call my history back as a constraint or madness. She stared at me once and said she saw her brothers doing life in my eyes. And this night, when we talk to each other, it is in shouts. The quilt of solitary cells I've known confess that my woman has never been my woman. How ownership and want for things made me split that bastard's head into a scream is what I'll never admit. What she tells me is, prison killed you, my love. Killed you so dead that you're not here now. You're never here. You're always. Her eyes closed at night and I awaken and swear she stares at me. She is saying that brown liquor owns me, saying that the cells own me and that there's no room for her unless she calls the police, calls upon the state, calls upon her pistol, and finally sets me free. So, I hate to be the one to tell y'all this, right? But poets have decided on a new thing. Capitalism.
Yeah, that's real.
Every time you clap, just say, you know what, I'm gonna buy 2 books. And you could buy 1 book for yourself, and you could buy 1 book for somebody in prison. And in fact, when you buy the book for yourself, no, this is real, this part though. When you buy the book for yourself, this is what I want you to do. Or when you get it from the library, or when you steal it. All of the above, right? I want you to read one of these poems that you clap into with your iPhone. I want you to click record, read it, and then I want you to send it to somebody you love. Because the only way that poetry matters, we talked about whether poems matter, they frequently matter when we're in the room. But the way that they matter when we're not in the room is if people share it. If it means enough for you to record it and click send, then that means it'll mean enough for somebody to listen to it. And then it might matter. A man drops a coat on the sidewalk and almost falls into the arms of another. As in almost Madame Suzanne in red, almost fall and almost no longer, as in almost only bent elbows, almost more than longing, almost more than unholy, more than skag white lady junk, almost more than a city eclipsing around them. Winchester gun factory's windows as broken as the pair refused to be. The 2 of them nodding off a diesel, almost greater than everything missing. The brown sugar, the adrenaline slowing them down, the remnants of a civilization emptied into their veins. The fallen man grasped the air, lost in a trance. These 2 anchored by a coat that nearly slips from a nameless man's fingers as he leans parallel to the concrete, as his arms reach for something absent, whatever about reaping. The men eclipse the sidewalk and everything else around them, and they sway with a funeral's pace. These 2, their bodies are still life lovers drag. I'm in the car with Nikki, and we cannot stop watching. I imagine one whispers, I wish I never touched it. But who, in the middle of a high that lets you escape time, utters such bullshit? One lacks sleeves. The other throws 7 punches into the air like an aging featherweight. I learned to box, desiring not to be broken or haunted by my dreams. And when Boxer throws 6 jabs at a cushion of air, I know once they both wanted to be something more than whatever we watch and imagine. A car stops in the street, no hazards, just stops, and a photographic arm extends the camera, offering history as the only help the 2 will get. A mechanical witness. I photo them capturing this world slow to loss. The 2 men now someone's memory. One almost caresses the face of the other. Lovers are never this gentle. are never this close to falling, and never patient enough to know that there's no getting up from some depths. A perfect day that's just like doom. Own so fucking world. They lean into each other without touching. Horse has slowed down everything. How like that you can walk for hours and imagine always that there is a needle waiting for your veins. And Nikki says it's a wonder how something that can have you hold another so gently could be the ruin of all you might touch. So, I like this book, you know. I'm biased, but I'm flipping through and I'm just gonna read one more. Then I'm like, no, I gotta read him this one. And I'm like, I should read him this one too, and that one. I'll read one more, and I'll tell a story, and then I'll read two more. I'll read a short one and a longish one. But I'll tell a story. A friend of mine, I got a phone call. This really can't be, I'm gonna change it a little bit, but it's interesting, right? Like, I got a call from somebody who has the freedom, the power, the ability to say when somebody else goes home. And I was having a conversation with this person who was a great person, at least to the degree that I know them, right? And we were talking about prison wine. And the thing was like, because a friend had got caught up with a bunch of wine in a cell, it posed a challenge to their freedom. And I thought about, you know, all of the liquor that's in the liquor store. And I thought about all the liquor that I've drank. And I thought about times that I've just been walking down the streets of New Haven and seen drunken college students. And how nobody said because you drunk today, you can't finish college. And the thing is, like, this person is great, but she couldn't understand how fucked up it is that something that we do every day could prevent somebody from having freedom just because they're locked up. And I don't know how to think about that. You know, when we talk about incarceration and we talk about the criminal justice system, I think one of the things we fundamentally don't discuss enough is the way in which it not only subverts and circumscribes how people engage when they're a part of the system, but it fucks with our own head. Like you, and she told me, she was like, and then I thought it was crazy because, you know, I drink. But it was nothing that she could do in that moment to like reconcile the fact of like this conviction, this institutional charge being a hiccup for release on parole. Because to get out, you have to be pristine. I wasn't even pristine coming here. Whiskey for breakfast. My liver awash in all but dregs of a charred oak cask, soaked in barley's amber, shadowed as blood, dim as a sail in a hole. Survive brackish prison water only to become collateral. The things that haunt me still drown, now friends say, in nearly 50 pounds of brick-cube rock gut. Spiritus fermenti. A gallon of whiskey weighs 8 pounds. And all this becomes a man confessing that he's riven. And I drink. Mornings I turn sunrise into another empty glass. And a dozen angels diving behind the mire I swallow to save my body from itself. They all scream. Me and even the cherubim, lost in that smoky, dense comfort. Lost in darkness. And sometimes I swear, even God has no alibi. All right, last poem. The only thing to know is that it's a crown of sonnets. So the last line, somebody knows what a crown of sonnets is. I hope that person is a lawyer. I'm gonna be so delighted. I'm not even gonna ask her. I'm just gonna be like, yo, I was in this law school and a lawyer knew what a crown of sonnets is. There's hope for humanity. If you notice, I'm not looking up because if I look up right now, she might be like, damn, I just ruined his life, you know. So it's a crown of sonnets, so the last line in one sonnet becomes the first line in the next one. The first sonnet is after a poem by somebody's name I can't remember, but it's called Prayer One. I know somebody in here knows it. And the point, I'm only saying this as though, so who wrote it again? No, it's old, dead dude, but not Manly. George Herbert, yeah. Did you say Jory Graham?
I said Graham at first, and then when you said older, I was like, oh, it's Herbert.
Yeah.
Because she has the ones after her, but that's all another discussion.
So the only thing to know about the first section is you might be listening for some verb or something, and all of those phrases are just me giving you synonyms for prison. All right, so when you hear that, that's just something to know. House of unending. 1. The sinner's bouquet. House of shredded and torn Dear John letters. Upended grave of names. Moon black kiss of epistles flat side. Time blue born and threaded into a curse. Lazarus of hustlers. The picayune spinning in the beatdowns. Breath of a thief stealed by fluorescent lights. A system of 40 blocks. Empty vials. A handful of purple cranes bills. Memories of crates suspended from stairs, tied in knots around street lamps. The house of unending push-ups, wheelbarrows and walking 20s. The daughters chasing their father's shadow, sons that upset the wind with their secrets. The paraphrase of fractured, scarred wings flying through smoke. Each wild hour of lockdown, hunger time, and a blackened flower. 2. Of lockdown, hunger time, and a blackened flower, ain't nothing worth knowing. Prison becomes home. The cell, a catacomb, the cages, and a metronome tracking the years that eclipse you. History authors your death, throws you into that den of lost hours. Your mother blames it all on your X chromosome, blames it on something in the blood, a styrofoam cup filled with whiskey leading you to court disfavor. To become drunk on count time and child call logic. There is no name for this thing you've become. Convict, prisoner, inmate, lifer, yardbird, all fail. If you can't be free, be a mystery, an amnesic, anything but avoid succumbing to the humdrum, swallowing a bullet, or even just choosing to inhale. 3. Swallowing a bullet or even just choosing to inhale. Both mark you. Pistol or the blunt to the head, escorting you through the night. Your yell and omen. The memories, the depression, the dead, and how things keep getting in the way of things. When he asked you for the pistol and you said no, the reluctance wasn't about what violence brings. His weeping in your ear made you regret what you owed. On some days, the hard ones, you cursed the phone. The people call and collect, reaching out, all buried, surrounded by bricks. On some days you've known you wouldn't answer. The blinking numbers as varied as the names of the prisons, holding on to those lives. Holding on, ensuring that nothing survives. 4. Holding on, ensuring that nothing survives. Not even regret. That's the thing that gets you. Holding on to memories like they're your archives, like they're there to tell you something true about what happened. My past put a skew on how I held her. Unaccustomed to touch, I knew only dreams and fantasy. Try to see through that mire and find intimacy. It was just so much, and then the yesterdays just become yesterday. A story that you tell yourself about not dying. Another thing when it's mentioned to downplay. That's what me and that woman did, trying to love each other. What kind of fool am I? Lost and was gone, reinventing myself with lies. 5. Lost and was gone, reinventing myself with lies. I walked these streets ruined by what I'd had. Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. I barely see my daughters at all these days. Out here caught up, lost in the old cliche. But tell me, what won't these felonies betray? Did a stretch in prison to be released to a cell, return to a freedom pen by Orwell. My noon temptation is now the Metro's third rail. In my wallet, I carry around my daguerreotype, a mugshot, no smiles, my name a tithe. What must I pay for being this stereotype? The pistols I carried into the night, my anchor. The crimes that unraveled me, my banner. The crimes that unraveled me, my banner. Only a fool confesses to owning that fact. Honesty is sinkhole. The truth doomed to subtract everything but prayer. Turn my breath into failure. Whiskey after prison made me crave amber. Brown wash in my glass until I'm smacked. The murder of crows on my arm, an artifact of freedom. Would outlast even a jailer. I would cut in to say this one weird thing in which I say that these poems aren't about me, and they are about me, and they aren't about me. And then I say all of this shit in the poems to make you be like, that's him. Because murder of crows on your arm is quite a distinct detail. But all of this is not me, but that part was me. Alas, there's no baptism for me tonight. No water to drown all these memories. The rooms in my head keep secrets that indict me still. My chorus of unspoken larcenies. You carry that knowledge into your twilight and live without regret for your guilty pleas. 7. And live without regret for your guilty pleas. Shit. Mornings I rise twice. Once for a count that will not come, and later with the city's wild birds who find freedom without counsel. I left prison with debts no honest man could pay. Walked out imagining I lapped my troubles. But a girl once said no to my unlistening ears, dismayed that I didn't pause. Remorse can't calm those evils. I've lost myself in some kind of algebra that turns my life into an equation that zeroes out, regardless of my efforts. Algophobia means to fear pain. I still fear who knows all I've done. Why regret this thing I've worn? The sinner's bouquet, house, shredded and torn. Thank you.
All right, now it's the Q&A portion, conversation portion, but because we have till 5:05, we got a little reprieve. Rather than me starting it with questions that I have tons of, I want to actually open it to you. Y'all heard me. Now, if y'all have questions, there are students in the aisles that can assist you in asking that question via microphone. So raise your hand so we know who you are. I see a hand all the way back there. Susan.
Roger, will you announce that we have books?
Wait, there's a microphone coming back to you, or?
They got books?
They got books in the back. They got books in the back. Or actually, say it again.
Are the poets going to sign?
They will sign the books, yes, yes. I'll announce that.
Where will you sign? I want to be there.
At the table where the books are.
I'll
This
go
is
get
super
ready.
efficient.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
It's,
There you go.
Hi, I want to first thank you both so much for reading aloud, and thank you, Roger, for organizing this as well. My name's Murphy, and I actually teach poetry at Travis County Correctional Complex every week. And so I was curious about what you would say in terms of the power of poetry and how you find it slipping in and changing or empowering people's lives, and not only as a narrative tool like what you were saying when you're sitting in a room full of public defenders, or as a narrative tool for somebody who is at a jail maybe 4 miles away from here.
I don't know. I mean, it's language. It's like, I think that, you just have a relationship with all kinds of things, and the language and the literature and poetry is something to have a relationship with. And I carried the words around in my head. I mean, I started writing in prison, without ever expecting to be a poet. And I started doing habeas petitions in prison without ever expecting to be a lawyer. I think that the similarity in both, I think, and we forget this, is that poetry is a thing, it's a tangible thing, but when you touch it, it doesn't have to lead to something in the future. It doesn't have to lead to some outcome, right? Sometimes the outcome and the joy is in a moment. And so for me, when I have taught poetry or when I talk to people about poetry, I try to emphasize, I guess I would emphasize two things though, right? First, it's like we read a bunch of shit, and we read a bunch of poetry, and we read these poems a lot to each other. We read them as we were revising. Like, we've had a long time to think about them, and they touch us differently emotionally, and it's lines that touch us different emotionally. And sometimes when we teach poetry, we think of it as a sort of intellectual exercise, and so people get intimidated because they think that they should get hit the first time with that line the first time they read it, when in fact, I think we should encourage somebody to have a lifelong relationship with a poem, to have a lifelong relationship with those lines, so that those lines can inform the things they do, even when those lines don't. Like, I'm struggling to write something else, and I'm hearing things that Natalie said. I'm like, oh, that just helped me think about this other thing. But I can only do that because I've already committed, one, to buying the book when it comes out, but two, yeah, I mean, you know, but but I've also committed to, like, I don't have to be able to explain colonial love poem today. I don't have to be able to explain the arithmetic poem today. I could just call it the arithmetic poem, and I'm not ashamed that I don't remember the full title. I wrote down the things that helped me, and when I go back to it again and again and again, those things will hold me in a different way. But that's what I would sort of tell them.
I think something too, for me, something that I am aware of and conscious of when I'm in conversation with some of the women who we work with, is there are a lot of ways that you just have to be very tough. You know, you have to be strong. I mean, there are certain ways that you're allowed to hurt, like state-sanctioned ways. But there are also ways that sometimes the stories or the way we tell our stories allow you to have a private kind of hurt that I think is really important, because everything is so public. And so if you can find private, public ways to be engaged, and something that these last few years, something that I used to tiptoe around it, but reading love poems, especially a queer love poem, you know, working with women who are incarcerated, like, it's illegal to masturbate in prison.
What?
And it's often, I mean, you know, it seems absurd, but it is. And so, like, just to imagine that every mode of pleasure or desire, like every way you could possibly know your body is being stripped, and if you can find something that becomes your own, and like Dwayne says, these things you can return to that nobody else can enter into, you know, so in a way, it seems like you can surveil poems because they're on the page, but they become something else when they leave the page, and that is possibly something that can't be surveilled, and I think that feels important.
All right, I see a question in the middle, right here. Brother man in the blue.
Good evening. Mahir Hasim, a psychology student. One of the topic that was, first of all, thank you all so much for reading your beautiful poem, and thank you, Roger, for planning this event. One of the topic that was brought up a lot was capitalism and the effect of the capitalism on our justice system, and the effect that it have that reduct the sources in our economy and getting the resources from so many of our population that led them to crime and so many of the things that give them to prison. How we can leave the poet or the philosophy of poet that you mentioned so many times to see how we can see us as a person, the emotion that we can touch us, or you mentioned as a lawyer, system of justice system, they can see how this capitalism that not be self-centered, to be able to see other people's perspective and other people's betterness in our society. If you can help us with that, thank you so much.
You know, I do think one thing that I hadn't thought about for a while is, you know, I'm usually frustrated when people think about private prisons and they talk about private prisons. And but I think one thing that prison helps us think about is you don't have to say private prisons are the whole problem, or to say like the way that capitalism operates within prisons are the whole problem. But what you can, I think, begin to do when you think about that is find failures in the system throughout. Like you think about the prison as like, yo, when you can't get good health care in prison, it really shows you how to think more holistically about the kind of health care that's available to people outside of prison. And so I do think that one way for me is to imagine prison as a space to ask what capitalism does. And so, for instance, Securus makes millions and millions of dollars. And you have some people who would say, like the sort of big foundations and the advocacy groups that talk about incarceration, many of them aren't advocating against Securus, right? But then, now some are, but many aren't. But then what happens, though, is if somebody else enters that same space to try to be a player in the capitalistic market that exists, they would then say, I can't mess with you because that will make it look like I'm aligning with people exploiting people incarcerated. Where Securus is already exploiting people incarcerated, and there might be a different model or version of creating a pathway to freedom. But I remember, and then I'll say just one other thing. I literally remember when I got locked up, and this is like a more global concern, in 1996, when they were getting rid of Pell Grants. And they had, it was so popular that it was on the #1 morning show. It was an issue of the day. You know, it wasn't in the back page of the newspaper. And everybody called and was like, why should you go to prison and get a free education? And the reason why people said that is because people were rooted to this notion of one or two ways of thinking about incarceration. It was either completely your fault, or if you were against incarceration, you might say something similar to what you just said, is why should we lock people up when they're just stealing or robbing to meet the needs that they don't have? I mean, I think it's a different version of thinking about incarceration, and not saying that you need to absolve somebody for culpability of the crimes that they commit. Somebody could be culpable for the crimes that they commit without having to go to prison, without having to go to a place where the violence levels far exceed any levels of violence in any community in America. Like, you can imagine a different system that helps us think through how to repair harms that we actually cause. And I think one of the troubles is that we don't have enough conversations about that, and that a person will think the only way I could be against the proliferation of prisons in America is if I say that the people who are in prison are somehow innocent. And I think that that's just a failure of the imagination. Yo. I don't know who had their alarm set, but it was nice. But listen, we got 5 more minutes. So,
right. Do you want to answer, Natalie?
No, that was great.
All right. Any other questions? I see a question hand over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that reading. I just had a question about immigration detention, and one of my partner's best friends is in immigration detention right now, and it's just been eye-opening to think about, some of the things that are the same, but also some things that are different. Like they told him point blank that he cannot have a lawyer. He cannot. No lawyer can see him, and that he's shuffled around to a different prison every 2 weeks so far, and doesn't even exist in the system, so it's impossible to find out where he is. So just thinking about how on the legal side or the poetry side, as this is getting more attention, immigration detention, how is there any way to represent legally or poetically that reality?
I mean, it's something that is a concern of my community. I'm very close to Eloy, and so we often house some of the women who are waiting for their court date. I mean, the detention center is another extension of the prison industrial complex. It's another way of deciding who is citizen and who is not, who is inside and who is not. Our entire U.S.-Mexico border is just a much different version of a prison. I think the hard thing about a lot of our women in Eloy will just get bused here to different places in Texas and sit in holding for 2 or 3 days, and then they bring them back just because. That kind of structure is the same reason why in Perryville our max moved down to medium, because now we can take those women and also move them so much easier. And so there's a way that our detention system is now kind of meeting our prison system. And I mean, we have women in Eloy who've been there 2 or 3 years, you know, women, and we think U.S. Mexico, but I mean, there's a huge population from Cameroon, you know, and yeah, I mean, other than to say it's the exact same system, and other than to say it's also extending, you know, we now have these towers going up along the border, you know, and so it's a matter, I think, of constellating it, and what happens to one group will also happen to the other group. And so hopefully some of the conversations here, you know, will constellate that, because what's happening to the migrants or the refugees can happen because of what's happening in our prison systems.
And I'll just say one thing. I'm not going to give you legal advice because I'm in a law school, and you shouldn't give legal advice when you don't know about an area of law. Usually I'm free with legal advice, actually. No, but the one absolute thing I'll tell you to do is first, I'm not certain that's true that he can't or she can't have a lawyer. I'm not certain that that's true, and I don't know the circumstances and don't want to ask you because I'm not an expert on immigration law. But I suggest that you look out, that you contact the people at this organization. Some classmates of mine came down here to Dilley, Texas, and they represented a bunch of people. And the strange thing about immigration law is that, like most people, like 90% of people coming into the country seeking asylum aren't represented by attorneys. 75% of the people who are represented by attorneys get asylum. And part of that is just that, you know, the law oftentimes is just a form. It's a sonnet. And when you have people who understand how to use the form and to deploy the form in the correct way, people get their asylum petitions granted. So what I suggest is you look up an organization called ASAP. It's the Asylum Seekers Advocacy Project. It's a national organization started by 4 young women, attorneys, brilliant folks, and I've seen them do the impossible. I've seen them say, somebody said to me, my wife is stuck in Canada because she's from Iran, but, our child is American and they won't let her in. Can you do something? And I've seen other organizations say, no, it's nothing that we could do. And my folks at ASAP got them back into the country within like 7 days. So I'm not saying that they could work a miracle in this case, but part of advocacy is understanding the people that had the expertise that we lack. And I think the first step is always figuring out where that expertise exists and try to reach out to that expertise in addition to these conversations. We are 1 minute over. We had permission to go 2 minutes over. So, Roger, do your thing.
So, now that I've been given permission, that's my man's. We're going to end this. There's going to be a 15-minute break. And then we're going to come back for the Sissy Farenthold lecture, with Ruthie Gilmore. Go out, buy books. Talk to each other. Enjoy yourself. We'll be back. 15.